Alright, thanks all for having me. I've come down from Brisbane this morning. It's a pretty tough task to go after Mark, but since he's introduced us to the fantasy world of housing affordability debate, I'm going to continue the fantasy theme by starting with an imaginary conversation. It's a conversation I would have with my grandfather if I could go back in time 30 years to 1987 when I was a small child. It might go like this. Grandad, how are you? I'm so glad I could come back from the future and tell you about all the amazing progress we've made. Oh, look at how you've grown. What amazing things can you tell me about? Well, remember how you were the first person out of everyone you knew to fly in an aeroplane? Well, in 2017, people fly all around the world all the time. Not only that, you know how you saw a computer once? Well, everyone's got one of them in their pocket. It's like an encyclopedia from the whole world, and it's been shrunk down. You can also video call anyone you like, anywhere in the world, anytime. We have clean energy, solar energy, electric cars are coming, it's amazing. Countries like China have brought themselves out of poverty. What an amazing world. That does sound fantastical, and how are you? Well, I'm 34 now, I've got a university degree, a PhD, so I'm the first in the family for that, and I have a lovely wife and 2 young boys. Oh, how lovely. You must have a beautiful house and garden with all those grand things the future holds. Well, Grandad, actually no. We live in a house much smaller than the one Mum and Dad moved into when they were first married. It's very similar, in fact. I actually don't think it's been renovated since the 80s either. And our garden, well, I've tried, but we don't want to put too much money and effort into it because I rent, Grandad. And although I have a university degree, and so does my wife, in fact, we can't buy a house. They cost $1 million in Sydney. Even in Brisbane, $500,000 won't get you far. Less if you go out of town, but it's hard to find work outside of the city. And we have no chance of saving over $100,000 for a deposit when our rent takes up 40% of our income. What's worse, the price of the average house in Australian capitals went up 11% last year. In Sydney and Melbourne, by more. The average home went up in price by more money than I could earn in that year. It's ridiculous. It's like trying to save for a deposit by running up the down escalator. You can never make progress. So we're in a pickle, Grandad. I can't have a nice garden because if we do spend the money and time to spruce it up, the real estate agent will see it and realise they can rent the house for more and then ask us to pay for it by putting the rent up at the end of our lease. And every year when the lease goes up, we don't know when the lease is up, we don't know if we can stay anyway. We've moved 4 times in the last 10 years. I don't think we'll ever have a house and a garden, Grandad. Probably not even a nice apartment. What an absurd situation. You have all this technology, a computer in your pocket, world travel, and you can't have a place with a nice garden to call your own. Back to reality. Despite being absurd, this conversation contains many truths about modern Australia, and it doesn't have to be this way. The past 30 years could have taken another path. By many metrics, Australia is one of the wealthiest handful of countries in the world. So why are we here at an event today, talking about the basic challenge of making housing secure and affordable? It makes no sense at all. If anyone can do it, we should. Many of our wealthy peers across the world have established home ownership as an option, and they've made laws that make renting a secure alternative. We could do it too. You see, the heart of this story is not really about housing. It's more about economic diversity. When wealthy countries ensure that economic investment is made across many different sectors and across the regions, they establish demand for skilled workers. And they establish demand for cheap housing from the companies who need to attract those workers to their areas. Mobility in Australia, in terms of people relocating for work, has been in decline. So, skyrocketing house prices, insecure rental laws are merely a symptom of this much broader economic problem we must confront. Would we be in a different 2017 today, I would have talked instead to my grandfather about Australia cementing its place as a global manufacturer of solar and wind energy, one of our natural advantages. We could be talking about our world-class satellite industry and a growing remote sensing industry that has revolutionised agriculture and that we're exporting to the world. I could have regaled my grandfather with those wonders instead. The reality is that Australia has dropped in the world rankings of economic productivity and diversity. Harvard University researchers called Australia a laggard of the Asian region, alongside Mongolia and Papua New Guinea. We've dropped in their rankings, from 32 in 1994 to 54 in 2008, and are falling. All we export now is dirt. Almost 70% is coal, iron ore, gold, and a handful of other minerals. Canada still beats us on the diversity scale, ranked 29, but they've declined from 19 20 years ago. And they have similar affordability problems to us with their housing. If I could build on what Mark said before, Australia is the world leader in their immigration intake. And something I worked out last weekend, if we simply dropped to second place to match Canada, we would have 1.3 million fewer people in Australia right now if we just become second place with our immigration program over the last 10 years than first place. That's 3 Canberras in 10 years. So we can see the narrowing of our economic base in the pattern of bank lending. Fundamentally, the pattern of new lending determines the patterns of real investment in the economy. It determines whether we invest in new manufacturing and production capabilities, or whether we just invest in housing. That's why the fast-growing Asian countries have state-owned banks to direct investment to expanding their productive capacity. Now let's look at Australia. In the early 1990s, over half of Australian bank lending was for business investment. Only 4% was for investor housing, and 25% for owner-occupier housing. Now, it's down to 30% for business, from half to 30%. Investor housing has jumped from 4% to 20%. And owner-occupier lending too has leaped from 25 to 40%, as everyone struggles to leverage as much as they can just to get into the market. But what's even worse is that 95% of that massive increase in investor housing lending is for established homes. It's up from 50% in the 80s. So only 5% actually gets directed to improving the stock of homes we have in our country. So what we're doing is directing our powerful monetary system, our bank lending, these great public services we have, away from new investment towards simply trading homes with each other and increasing their price. So why is this? In many ways, it's a conscious political choice. While the decline of our economic diversity has failed the average worker, it has been a boon for the landlord class and the owners of the mineral wealth in Australia. Those who already own their land and housing benefit at the expense of those who want access for housing for their own household security. Those who own the banks, well, they benefit too. And we've seen the enormous lengths to which the government will go to support the way things are. Every housing affordability policy, from the first home buyers grant to accessing super, is expressly designed not to let house prices fall and housing become affordable. So what can work? Well, the main challenge here is political. One thing we can do is have a short list of effective policies proposed, analysed, scrutinised, ready to be adopted when the political timing is right. So let's start by debunking a bit of a furphy. Anyone who says we need less regulation and freer markets to solve housing affordability is a fool. They've not thought it through, they've failed to take consideration of the extensive evidence in other wealthy countries that do promote affordable housing. And Australia's problem comes in many ways from embracing these market forces without consideration. Some of it stems from the lobbying pressure to sell the assets of the nation on the cheap to private interests, to privatise our wealth, and then give these private monopolies all this political power to lobby, to increase immigration, to get the public to then support their monopoly, rather than using what we had, the various public institutions, to actually expand investment and lay the platform for the private sector to innovate. And it's always been like that. For example, the space race of the 1960s had huge economic benefits outside just of the technical industries. We know that the waves of public investment in our cities also supported private sector producers in transport, communications and health. The same is true today. We actually need to defy market forces from time to time if we want to make progress. We need to gamble with public investment in major capital projects, yes, including the NBN, for the future. For example, it's not too late to do some economic CPR on the manufacturing sector if we want to. We could build up the clean energy and information technology future we want. Moving now to banking. We should see new lending and money creation from the banking system as a social function, a public service. What we've done, though, is let this money creation gift we provide our banks, and we guarantee, be used to fund land and housing speculation rather than business and new investment. This is a natural market outcome in the absence of regulations that direct our monetary system into achieving broader economic goals. So we need to massively tighten lending rules for banks to the housing market and force them to look elsewhere and take risks with genuine productive investment. We could go beyond loan-to-value ratio rules, for example, that limit the loan to a fixed percentage of the value of housing. For investors, we could restrict lending based on the rental income of a property. So rather than let house prices inflate far above rents, the amount of lending would be tied to that rental income. We could completely ban investor lending, except for new homes. Investors leveraging to buy houses, existing houses, doesn't add to our housing stock at all. While this might seem an extreme proposition, we're a wealthy nation struggling with providing housing affordability, and that seems like an extreme problem to me. We should also be taxing unproductive activities and untaxing the productive ones. That means changing our land and mineral rights tax systems. The ACT, for example, is 6 years into a 20-year transition away from stamp duties and towards land value taxes. There are loopholes in the petroleum resource rent tax, where we get our income from our natural gift of petroleum, that could be closed, and we could expand taxes there and replace the taxes that come on productive activity. As you might now be thinking though, expanding such taxes, like the minerals resource rent that was proposed, face huge, huge barriers from vested interests. And that's where the true heart of the problem is. In terms of housing specifically, we could ban foreign purchases altogether. I see absolutely no reason not to. It's a clear myth that we need money, we're short of money to build houses for ourselves. Investors borrowed $120 billion last year from Australian banks. 95% of that was just to buy existing houses off each other. If that was instead directed to new housing, we could have built far more than 300,000 new homes, which is, far more than one per person of new people. On the same note, the 50% seat capital gains tax discount merely serves to increase the payoff from speculation rather than investment. It was a mistake, we can admit it, and we can scrap it and move on. I also want to talk about renting, which a lot of people don't talk about in housing affordability. I don't really care if you own your house or not, I just want you to be secure and comfortable. So we have to think about renting. It needs to be a valid alternative. And to that end, my general view is that we need to shift the balance of bargaining power away from landlords towards tenants. And there's a number of ways to do this. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, we just look at countries that have had successful rental laws for many years. We can remove the no-fault termination of leases to give tenants ongoing rights to stay where they are and feel secure. And we can put limits on the rental increases each year based on local conditions or inflation. This is not crazy stuff. France, Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands. You name a wealthy country that's tackled housing affordability, and this is the rules they have. Vacant homes. We know there are a lot of homes kept vacant in order to time the market for asset speculation. The last thing you want to do when you sell your house is to have a tenant there with a lease. What you want to do is, if you're timing the market, make sure you keep that option open. All of that simply removes the security that tenants get in the housing market. We can also think about social housing more broadly. Australia's investment in social housing has dropped dramatically in the last 20 years. And what we want to do is provide publicly funded, or we can make it a condition of private development approvals, a stock of housing that we allocate not by letting people outbid each other on rent, but by some other system based on need, based on merit, or some sort of lottery. There's no reason that everybody has to outcompete each other in these market conditions when what we're actually after is secure housing. Before I finish, I should comment briefly on supply because it has been mentioned. Many people see this as the answer, despite the fact that, as Mark said, Australia has had a historic housing boom, housing construction boom. In fact, we have more housing per person than any time in history, right now. And yet, housing affordability is still a debate, and we're still here having this discussion. What we should know, though, is that even though we've had the world record housing supply boom, rental prices are only moving downwards 1–2% in some cities, but not all. The effect on supply is actually rather minimal when it comes down to it. Rezoning is another myth about the supply side. No one who's ever lobbied for rezoning has ever actually lobbied to force the landowner who benefits to build any housing, which is ridiculous when you think about it. It makes no sense if the landowner has refused to supply housing for decades to now go, oh, you're allowed to build a little bit more housing. Can you please build it now? Oh, no, thank you. If you really wanted housing built, you would make it a condition of rezoning to supply housing in a prompt manner. The problem with rezoning is it's a pure gift to the landowner, and what we end up with is the property development industry who's lobbying governments for gifts under the myth that it's what's going to increase supply and solve housing affordability. Now I have a solution to that which should contain a lot of that lobbying. The solution is what the ACT has done for over 50 years. They charge the landowner for the extra value gains from rezoning. And if there are no value gains to have, you won't hold out and ask for them. We can actually follow the planning rules we have and not play this huge game of giving gifts to landowners based on a myth that rezoning them is going to solve housing affordability. In Sao Paulo, Brazil, another example, they auction rezoning rights every month, and they've raised $10 billion in 10 years from that. I'll wrap up now. I'd love to have gone back in time and had a different conversation with my granddad from an alternative 2017. One where there was more to life than speculating on housing, and we could laugh at the idea of having a housing renovation reality TV series. We could instead talk about gardening. What I hope is that though we can't change the past, what we can do is take stock of where we are and change the future. So that if my grandchildren have a meeting like this one day, it won't be about affordable housing. It'll be about something else that they're passionate about, and they'll have a secure house and a beautiful garden. Thank you.